Think you know what a sultan's harem was? Forget it. Picture a ruler who forced hundreds of the most beautiful women to crawl on all fours, pretending to be horses while he whipped them. Picture mutilated slaves, castrated with a red-hot knife. Who became the third most powerful people in the empire? Now, picture nearly 300 of his concubines, on his orders, being stuffed into sacks weighted with stones and drowned in the strait in a single night. This isn't some TV fantasy. This is the real story of madness and power they never wanted you to know. The path to the golden cage was a road to hell. So, are you ready? Thought we'd jump straight to the silk and gold after that intro. Think again. Remember this, the road to any golden cage is always paved with the cobblestones of hell. And our story doesn't begin with balls and banquets, but with a scream that no one heard. Forget everything you've seen in the movies. No noble pirates. Just filthy, stinking bastards who leaped out of the coastal bushes as she, young Lee, was simply walking down a path to the sea. A blow to the back of the head. A rough sack over her head, stealing her breath. A gag in her mouth, soaked with someone else's spit and grime. Just imagine for a second, one moment you were free, you had a family, a name, a future. A moment later, you're just cargo. A sack of bones and meat being dragged across the ground. And this is where the real carnage begins. The slave ship. This is the part they definitely don't show you in those sanitized TV dramas about sultans. The hold. Utter, absolute darkness, broken once a day by a dim ray of light when they threw down the slop they called food. There, my God, there. It was a thick, heavy stew of sweat, urine vomit, and animal terror. Air you could cut with a knife, air that seeped under your skin and stayed there forever. Dozens of bodies, piled on top of each other, women, children, men all thrown in together, lice, dysentery, fever. Someone moans in pain, someone else is quietly going insane. And someone else is already dead, their body lying next to you. Slowly growing cold in this suffocating hellhole. And you lie there in this rotting mess, listening to the creaking planks and the crying, and you understand you're no longer a person, you're a thing, cargo. And your only value is in surviving until you reach the market, the rats that scurried over there. Bodies seemed like the freest creatures in that hell, and then came the market. Think things got any easier? Ha! They were herded out into the scorching sun, naked, blinded by the light. Doused with ice-cold water from buckets to wash off the worst of the filth. And put on a platform. Like cattle. Buyers walked down the rows, shamelessly poking and prodding their bodies like a mare before a sale. Pried open their mouths to check their teeth. Pulled back their hair to look for scabies. They touched their breasts, their hips, appraising them. All of it with a cold, business-like expression. And they stood there, humiliated, broken, trying to cover their nakedness with their hands, only to get a lash from a whip for their trouble. Lee was bought by some fat, sweaty eunuch for the Sultan's harem. He didn't look at her as a woman. He looked at her as an investment. He had paid his money, and now she was his property. And right there, in that moment, the final murder took place. The murder of her identity. She was brought to a room where an old, severe woman with dead eyes told her, "Forget your name. Forget your life." Lee died in that filthy hold. From now on, your name is Gubahar. Spring Rose. What a sick joke, right? To name a girl whose entire life and soul had just been ripped out by the roots of Spring Rose. It wasn't just a new name. It was a brand. A mark that you no longer belong to yourself. From now on, you are Gubahar, a slave. The Sultan's property. And your only path is to either die in obscurity or claw your way to the top over the heads of all the other Spring Roses. Psychological torture in a gilded prison, and right here, my friends, is where it gets interesting. Because clawing your way over heads wasn't just a pretty metaphor. It was the fucking job description in the harem. And our Gubahar learned that very quickly. You think the harem is some kind of fairy tale? Silk pillows, rivers of sherbet, languid beauties. Throw that garbage out of your head. Picture an elite, Maximum security women's prison, only instead of a uniform, you're wearing silk. And instead of gruel, you get baklava. But the essence is the same. A gilded cage. Stuffed with hundreds of hungry, ambitious, and terrified girls. And in this cage, there is a hierarchy, a brutal one. At the very bottom, you're a newcomer, a Jurai. Your job is to mop floors, carry trays for your seniors, and keep your head down. You are nobody. Dust under their feet, one wrong look, one extra word. And you could be whipped half to death or simply left to rot in some filthy kitchen. But if you're beautiful, smart, and most importantly, if you have teeth, you have a chance to climb a rung higher. To become a ghost, one who has caught the eye of the Sultan. That's when the master notices you. But that's not victory. It's just an invitation to the next circle of hell. Because now, they don't see you as dust anymore. They see you as a threat. Think you can find a friend in this hell? A sister in misery to cry on her shoulder? Yeah, right. That's the first and biggest mistake a rookie makes. Your best friend is your main competitor. Tonight you whisper secrets in the dark. And tomorrow she is running to the headmistress to report that you are still praying to your Christian God. Or worse, you share your deepest secret with her, say, your mortal fear of enclosed spaces. A week later, as punishment for some minor infraction, you're locked for a full day in a cramped, windowless stone closet. Just a coincidence, right? Every weakness you have is a weapon in the hands of the girl in the next bed. And watching over this whole circus are them. The eunuchs. Those guys they show in TV shows as some kind of harmless, chubby sidekicks. What a lie in reality. They were the security service, the Gestapo, and the HR department all rolled into one. They weren't just guards. They were walking recorders and surveillance cameras. They heard every whisper, saw every glance. They knew who was friends with whom, who hated whom, who said what in their sleep last night. And all that information flowed to the top, and it was used against you. And in this atmosphere of total surveillance and paranoia, the accidents began. They definitely don't teach you this in the history books. One girl, a top contender for a night with the Sultan, went to the hammam and accidentally slipped on the wet marble, right on the back of her head against the sharp corner of a fountain. They say the crack was heard in the next room. Another one, an incredible beauty with copper-colored hair, suddenly broke out in a horrific, pustular rash. Her face swelled up, became a mask. The doctor just shrugged. An allergy. A convenient allergy, wasn't it? Right before she was summoned to the Sultan's chambers. Or here's another charming one: poisonings. No one was crude enough to dump arsenic in the soup. No, they'd soak a thread in the carpet where a girl liked to sit with poison. Or mix something into her hair oil, causing it to fall out in clumps. Slowly, imperceptibly, agonizingly. And you couldn't prove a thing. It was just God's punishment or ill health. And you just walked around, wondering who was next. And wondering if that sweet piece of Turkish delight your smiling neighbor is offering you will be your last supper. And our Gulbahar, our formerly. She saw it all. She absorbed this poison, this paranoia, like a sponge. She looked at the disfigured faces, heard the quiet sobs at night, and saw the triumphant smirks on the faces of the victors. And she understood. In this golden meat grinder, it's not the most beautiful or the kindest who survives. It's the most cunning, most ruthless snake. Death here wears silk dresses and smells of rosewater. She learned the #1 rule of this game: don't wait to be struck, strike first. And she had already chosen her first target. They were mutilated. And they became the most vicious executioners. All right, are you ready? Because we're about to dive into a darkness so black, it'll make the last chapter look like a bedtime story. So, our girl understood that the palace wasn't about love, but about survival. About sinking your clothes into the throat of anyone standing in your way. She had chosen her target. But here's the kicker they don't tell you about in the pretty TV shows. To land a blow in the snake pit, you don't need poison or a dagger. You need the one who holds the keys to every door. The one who sees everything, hears everything, and decides whose scream goes unheard tonight. And those people, my friends, weren't the Sultan as in their brocade. They were the shadows in the dark corridors, the ones considered mere servants, the walking dead. The eunuchs. You think a eunuch is just some castrated servant who serves sherbet. Oh, how wrong you are. They were the most feared men in the entire Ottoman Empire. And now I'm going to tell you why. Picture a little boy, 7, maybe 9 years old. He's kidnapped from his village somewhere in Africa. Shipped halfway across the world in the hold of a stinking ship. And then they break him. I'm not talking about his spirit. They'll get to that later. I'm talking about his body. This operation, castration, was done without anesthesia, with a dirty, red-hot knife. Most of the boys simply died from shock or infection. Their small bodies would fester for weeks, their screams muffled by the walls of special barracks. The smell of burnt flesh and terror, that was the scent of their new calling. Those who survived were no longer human. Everything had been taken from them: family, homeland, a future. The very ability to be a man. They were turned into Enet. And this is where the true horror begins. When everything is taken from you, you're left with only one thirst. A thirst for power, the very same power that was used against you. These mutilated, broken boys grew up to be the most merciless jailers the world has ever known. Their own pain became their greatest weapon. They knew no mercy because none had ever been shown to them. They became the eyes and ears of the harem. They eavesdropped on whispers behind silk curtains, read other people's letters, knew who was sleeping with whom, who was plotting against whom. They were the judges. Any girl who broke a rule wasn't judged by the Sultan. She was brought before the chief eunuch, and his word was law. And they were the executioners. It was the eunuchs who drowned the sultans and wanted concubines in the Bosphorus, who strangled wayward maids with a silk cord, who carried out the filthiest of orders. They did it with stone-cold, dead expressions, because they were already dead inside. But that's not even the half of it. Buckle up. The chief black eunuch, the so-called Kaiser Aga, was, in effect, the third most powerful man in the empire. Yes, you heard that right. First came the Sultan, second, his mother, the valid Sultan, and third was this man, who didn't even have his own name, only a title. Why? Because he controlled the most valuable asset of all, the harem. He controlled access to the Sultan's bed. He decided which concubine would enter his chambers tonight, and that meant he controlled the birth of heirs. He was the valid Sultan's chief advisor, her right-hand man. He managed vast lands, took bribes, and appointed and dismissed officials at will. Just let that sink in, the sheer, twisted paradox of it all. A man stripped of his manhood decided the fate of the world's most powerful dynasty. A victim of the most monstrous cruelty became its chief instrument. And that's when our heroine, staring at her rival, the one she'd chosen as her first target, had an epiphany. Kill the girl. Too simple. Too foolish. It would solve nothing. 10 others would just take her place. The rules of the game were far more complex. You didn't just take a piece off the board. You had to befriend the hand that moves the pieces. She didn't need to sharpen a dagger in her room. She needed to find a way to make the chief executioner of this golden cage work for her. But how do you do that when, to him, you were just another piece of meat he could have stuffed in a sack and drowned at any moment? But that is a whole other story. Sultan Ibrahim I, a walking disaster on the throne, but that is a whole other story. And to understand how to play this game of survival, you first have to look into the eyes of the real boss. To gaze upon the very executioner who holds the keys to this golden cage. And believe me, those eyes had seen hell. So, are you buckled in? Because we're about to dive into the most rotten, darkest soul in the Ottoman Empire. Meet Sultan Ibrahim I. Actually, to hell with Sultan. What we have here is a broken, terrified man who, by some cruel twist of fate, was handed power over millions of lives. They won't tell you this in the history books, those are all prim and proper. But I'll give it to you straight. Picture this, 22 years. 22. You're locked in the cave's a gilded cage for princes, and every single goddamn day, you wait for them to come for you. Not with a tray of sherbet, but with a silk cord to strangle you. Your brothers, your uncles, your nephews, they were all led from rooms just like this and killed. You hear footsteps in the hall and your blood runs cold. A door creaks open, and you're already saying your last goodbyes. 22 years of raw, sticky, animal fear that seeps under your skin, into your bones, into your very soul. What do you think that does to a man's psyche? That's right. It turns it into a bloody mess. When Ibrahim, shaking and stammering, was literally dragged from his cage and forced onto the throne, he didn't believe it. He was convinced it was another trap, that they were about to kill him. They had to show him his predecessor's corpse before he finally understood he was in charge now. And so this walking bundle of nervous breakdowns and hallucinations became master of the world. He suffered from horrific fits, screamed in the night, and talked to the shadows on the walls. His mind, poisoned by decades of terror, could no longer tell reality from nightmare, and he began to bring his nightmares to life. You think he busied himself with state affairs? He had more important things on his mind. For instance, he ordered his men to find him the fattest woman in the world, not just plump, but a literal, honest-to-God human mountain. Messengers scoured the empire, searching for this living ideal born from his sick imagination. They found one somewhere in Armenia, brought her to the palace, and he showered her with gold, giving her the title Governor-General of Damascus, just because he could. But that, my friends, was child's play. The real horror began in the harem. This wasn't some paradise garden. It was a private freak show for an audience of one. Ibrahim loved to humiliate. He forced his concubines, these beautiful young girls, to dress in animal hides and crawl on all fours through the palace gardens, pretending to be mares. And he, the great sultan, would walk among them, tossing them oats, neighing like a horse, and lashing out with a whip at any who displeased him. Can you feel that taste of humiliation? That filth that sticks to your skin and never, ever washes off. And now, let's get back to our heroine, the one who was sharpening her dagger. She wasn't watching this from the sidelines, like you and I. She was there, in that garden, perhaps one of those very mares. So how do you make not just a cruel tyrant, but an unpredictable madman, work for you? A lunatic whose whims change faster than the weather over the Bosphorus. How do you find that one tiny crack in his rotten to the core soul, grab hold of it, and survive? When to him, you're not a woman, but just another exhibit in his collection of nightmares. The shocking execution. So what happens when one of the exhibits in this gruesome collection turns out to be defective? When a scratch appears on the gleaming surface of a perfect toy, ready to buckle up again. Because we're about to plunge to the absolute depths of madness. Literally. You won't see this in some sugar-coated historical drama. They'll show you intrigue, poisons, whispers behind silk curtains. But reality, as usual, is far filthier and more terrifying. One day, a rumor reached our Sultan Ibrahim, not proof, not an informant's report, not a concubine caught red-handed, just a rumor, a wisp of smoke without a fire, that one of his concubines, one of hundreds, had dared to, well, exchange a glance with someone, smiled at someone. Maybe it was nothing at all. You think he launched an investigation, called in the eunuchs for a thorough interrogation. That's too boring for our psychopath. Why pull one rotten tooth when you can rip out the entire jaw? His logic was as simple and monstrous as a sledgehammer to the face. If one was tainted, they were all tainted. The whole batch was defective. And what do you do with a defective batch? That's right. You throw it out. He gave an order. An order that must have made even his most batshit crazy executioner's balls shrivel. Gather them all. All of them. Nearly 280 women. Girls who had been brought from all over the world, who knew only how to obey and how to fear. They were dragged from their warm chambers, sleepy, terrified, with no idea what was happening. And then, the conveyor belt to hell began. Picture the scene, night. The grim vaults of the palace. And a long, endless line of women being shoved, one by one, into sacks. Coarse, stinking burlap sacks. A stone was thrown in with each one, a weight to make damn sure. Can you imagine that raw, sticky terror? You can't see a thing. You can only feel the rough fabric scratching your face, the ropes being tied. They are running out. All around you are hundreds of others just like you. And you don't hear screams, but a muffled, choked wailing coming from the sacks around you. It was a chorus of the damned. Then they were loaded onto boats, silently, methodically, like bags of trash, rowed out to the middle of the Bosphorus, under the cold, indifferent stars. And they began to throw them overboard. One by one, sack after sack, a splash. Silence. Another sack. A splash. Silence. Nearly 300 times, until the last of them had vanished beneath the dark, oily water of the strait, until the last air bubble had surfaced. The palace was empty. The harem, which had been the heart of the empire, a center of life and beauty, had become an underwater cemetery in a single night. And at this point, folks, even for the Ottoman Empire, which had seen its fair share of fucked up shit, this was too much. This massacre was the final straw. Word of it leaked beyond the palace walls. This wasn't just murder. It was a desecration, a slap in the face to everything, to God, to tradition, to humanity. A Padishah who drowns his women like a sack of stray kittens is no longer a ruler. He's a monster that's broken its leash. Patience had run out. The janissaries, the viziers, even his own mother realized this psycho had to be stopped, or he wouldn't just drown the harem in the Bosphorus, but the entire empire along with it. The wheel of history turned with a groan, and the sword that had hung over the heads of hundreds of innocents was now poised over his own neck. After all, what do you do with a monster who has devoured not only his women, but his own soul? That's the real price of the golden cage. Not silk and jewels, but hundreds of drowned souls at the bottom of the Bosphorus, and madness wearing a crown. If you're into this kind of raw and flinching takedown, where we're not afraid to call it like it is, what are you waiting for? Smash that subscribe button and ring that bell so you get yanked out of your sweet dreams for the next story. And now for the main event in the comments. Which historical hero or beauty that everyone romanticizes was actually a total monster? Whose perfect mask do you want us to rip off next?